It's February 1996. Ang Lee's Sense and Sensibility lands in UK cinemas, and almost overnight, the Regency stops being a dusty English literature assignment and becomes a full-body fantasy. Windswept estates, muddy hems, longing looks, and Alan Rickman delivering romantic pain like it's national service. It arrives hot on the heels of Pride and Prejudice phenomenon, and suddenly millions of us aren't just watching history, we're booking it. This episode is about the moment when screens become a travel agent and when heritage becomes something you don't just visit, it performs for you. Heritage on film and TV don't simply entertain us. They build period worlds so seductive we want to step inside them. But what do we gain when we enter the past through a camera lens? And what gets polished away when we turn Revolution-era stories into a marketable aesthetic? To explore the boom in screen tourism and a deeper cultural revolution beneath it, I'm joined by Seren Welch, one of the UK's leading screen destination consultants and friend, and with over 25 plus years of tourism marketing, from global campaigns at Visit Britain to shaping location narratives for WGBH masterpiece PBS dramas like Downton Abbey, Victoria, Sherlock, and Poldark, Seren has helped define how story becomes place and place becomes experience. Together, we'll trace the long arc from 1776 to 1848, an era when ideas about class, rights, nationhood, and women's agency were fought over in real time, through the women who still set our cultural imaginations alight. Austen's razor-sharp realism, the Bronte's gothic fury, and, of course, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and her iconoclastic life. Then we'll jump to the present and ask the real question. In the age of set jetting, how do we turn screen-inspired curiosity into ethical, inclusive, sustainable cultural tourism without turning living places into theme parks? This is history, for fuck's sake, at its most meta. The past as a destination, the screen as the doorway, and the heart flutter of what we think we're going to find when we arrive. Seren, it's great to have you on History for fuck's sake. Tell us your story.
Well, it's fantastic to be on a podcast talking about history for sake. So, I mean, the great thing is about screen tourism and the journey I've taken to get here is that quite often it's just about you literally fall into different opportunities and it's ideas that take you down different paths. I guess if I trawl it way back, I've always been a lover of film. I've always been intrigued by the way worlds are created and why I, as a viewer, have always wanted to fall in love with it. Whether it's watching your first BBC childhood drama and thinking, what a magical land, I'd like to escape into that land, or the aspiration as a child of you want to be a certain character, you align to a certain character. And literally a couple of years ago, I was asked, what did you want to be when you were 7 years old, in an interview? And I immediately said, Luke Skywalker. Where other people were saying doctors and lawyers. And no, I really did want to be Luke Skywalker at 7. So I think that sort of forged my interest in film and TV and started out the journey. I did a degree in it. I was like, wow, I love this. That sounds like a pretty cool degree, because I didn't really know what to do. And that degree path led me through an insight into, obviously, actual production. So I was driving around the Devon and Cornwall countryside, making university documentaries about ghost hunting. I remember as a particular favourite of mine, when wouldn't do it now, obviously, but the 4 of us that were working on the project, one of them was strapped to the roof rack of my car to get a point of view shot of a headless horseman down a very, very narrow Devon country lane at night. Mm-hmm. It's a good job that we could overlay the sound with something else, because he was screaming quite a lot while holding onto the camera. But it's that kind of thing where I started down that journey from a production perspective. And interestingly enough, what caught my attention actually was more how communication is used through film production. And I actually specialised in propaganda and military propaganda for my final year. Finished that degree, felt like a complete fraud that I'd had far too much fun while doing a degree and decided to stay on and do a master's in ethics and social responsibility, where I actually looked at, do we have the right to travel? And what is the impact? And do we have the right to travel? So when I think about it, although I had no intention then of working and sitting here today talking about screen tourism, I actually did 2 degrees, which actually led me into that path, but with no intention of doing it. From there, I went to work on, I went to work from a local authority perspective and became a tourism officer. Then I went to work at Visit Britain, where that was a great journey, where I actually was in overseeing product development. And I took an idea to, I remember my then director and said, there are these books that everyone is reading and they're going to be making them into films. And it's going to be huge. And we really, really should be talking to Warner Brothers about it. Um, and I said, and he said, oh, well, they're just about some kid who's a wizard, aren't they? And I went, yeah, but it's massive. Everyone is reading them, and we should be doing something about it. So my first screen tourism project was the release of the first Harry Potter film. It was such a big thing at the time, obviously because of the millions around the world that had read the books, that when we put the website live, the traffic completely crashed it within the first hour, which was sort of like, yay, oh my God, what are we going to do kind of moment. And that went on, and I worked on numerous films throughout my time at Visit Britain, whether that was King Arthur adaptations to classic, what I call frocks and bonnets output, which always ticks a box, especially with the US market. And then just as I was sort of leaving sort of my time at Visit Britain, I got into a discussion around a new series that was happening that was going to be going out on ITV, funded by WGBH Masterpiece. It was this resurgence of this upstairs, downstairs kind of love and mentality of how Britain is portrayed. And I was pulled into a meeting at number 10 to talk about something called Downton Abbey. So that was my switch from working on predominantly film release across into high-end TV production. And since then, in the last 10 to 12 years, the transformation of how we engage with that content source has changed because of the streamers. Content never dies. You never have to wait for anything. And when you do, we don't like it. We can't bear waiting a week for the next episode. And content is always on, it's always there. And the different ways in which that content and how we engage with it is literally constantly changing. So that's sort of like a snapshot, sort of like elongated journey. And now I find myself talking about screen tourism all the time.
I think it's brilliant. We actually share a not too dissimilar journey as well. My dad um, uh, gave me my love of cinema as well, and to this day we speak about 2-3 times a week, and we discuss what we're watching and give each other recommendations. And I was recommending to him yesterday to watch Sinners. And I said, might not be your cup of tea, Dad, but stick with it, okay? um, and but he actually he I remember this so clearly. He took me when I was 8 years old to, and I think it was probably a WGBH PBS production of The Little Dorrit, all 8 hours of it. And it was being shown at our rep cinema, one of our rep cinemas in Toronto, for an all afternoon. And he took me at the age of 8. He and I went to see The Little Dorrit for 8 hours. I have to say I was a little bit on the young side for that. But as I got into my teens, we actually ended up doing that a lot. He took me to see Muriel's Wedding. He took me to see Sense and Sensibility. We went to the movies together. And it was, when I was 7, when somebody asked me what I wanted to be, I said I wanted to be a princess because my mother is English and my dad's Canadian. But my whole sort of understanding of what a princess was when I'm growing up in Toronto in the early 80s was entirely through our screens and through what is shown on TV. So, so yeah, I then went on to do my degree in British history, and then I did my master's in global communications and transnational media, which for the last 20 odd years, I kind of went, well, that was kind of a funny choice of master's degree, Sarah. And now it's all come round again, and it's like, oh, good choice, very good choice in master's degree now, 25 years later. So yeah, and then I now work in heritage, running my own companies, and you and I have done work together, and have bonded over our discussions around Bridgerton over the last few years, and hence we're here today. So yeah, it's so funny, and I think back to the 1990s, and when Pride and Prejudice came out, and good old Colin Firth. He's never ever going to ever live that one down. He is an icon, a national treasure, because of that. To the point where I do theater directing, and I directed Pride and Prejudice about 10 years ago. And even though it's not in the play script, we actually had our Mr. Darcy with the wet shirt on, and our costumer, who was a lovely woman in her 70s, every night would get the shirt wetter and wetter and wetter, and would be giggling even more at our Mr. Darcy, who was starting to laugh about how he was getting wetter and wetter and wetter for every night of the show. Um, and yeah, that Jane Austen-esque sort of period in the 1990s, where those national who are now national treasures, Hugh Grant, Emma Thompson, the late great Alan Rickman, Kate Winslet. I mean, my God, I think of her as Mary Ann way more than I think of her in Titanic. That to me is just that was Kate Winslet to a T. And it always made me feel safe. It fed my Anglophile sort of tendencies, and it made me want to come to Britain. It made me want to explore those places. I was 15 years old when I first started coming on my own for the summer times with my aunt, and I would buy myself copies of Country Life magazine. Like, what 15-year-old buys Country Life magazine? Okay. And it's all because of what I'd seen on screen. So, yes, it's incredibly um, poignant and pertinent to me. So, I guess my first question, after now I've shared, my entire adolescent trauma with everybody, is what do you think that makes period adaptations travel inspiring? Is it the landscape, the architecture, the romance, the fantasy of elsewhere? What is it from your perspective?
Well, I think it's a combination of everything. And I think it's that sort of, especially when a film or TV adaptation finds its roots in literature, we feel that even if we haven't read the book, we feel a familiarity with it. And we like to travel and think that we are going to meet somebody who would be great to, that we can share memories with, or we travel to meet up with someone, and they've always been intrinsic sort of drivers to travel. So when you actually sort of interject somebody traveling because they have been inspired by or have a relationship with something they've seen on screen, they're not just traveling to a destination, they're traveling to meet up with a friend because they had that relationship. And I think it's I was trying to explain this the other day to somebody, because there is a difference between film and TV. TV, if it's a series, we have time to nurture that relationship. We don't have to sit down and have the whole of that experience in one go. So we grow to learn more about the depths of the characters. So when we visit, even if they're not there, we are visiting them in that place, in that location. I did, I mean, I'm gonna tell you how I describe it, and I say that a memorable film is like a one night stand. It is memorable, but you move on. And quite often, film, unless it's part of a franchise, which is where you build your understanding of the characters, it's something you recall, and you might pop over and see it, or it might flit across your memory banks, and you think, oh yeah, I loved that. But a TV drama, is something that you take home to the family. You share it with your friends, you share it with other members of your family, and you talk about it because it is constantly on a cycle to re-engage you. So when you have TV dramas like All Creatures Great and Small, for example, classic comfort blanket TV, which goes out and is loved probably more outside of the UK than it's loved in the UK, it's that kind of nurturing of that relationship. So you forge your relationship with the characters, you forge your relationship with the narrative, then they disappear from your screen. And that's when you go looking for them because you've just lost a very close friend that you've shared hours with. And you go in search for them. And this is that instigator of where we literally pick up our other screen device and we start searching. And we start searching for where we can find them. Where did they go? Where was that scene shot? Is there a tour? Can I book it? All this kind of thing. And it's noticeable where you see spikes. And that really, because of the quality of the drama and the kind of budgets that were put behind those film and TV adaptations from the 90s, that was the instigator, I feel, of really getting people to engage with that British heritage, the landscapes, all that part of those narratives, because they are characters in their own right. And we can find them. Can't always find Emma Thompson. She's a bit elusive.
It's you talk about All Creatures Great and Small, and nostalgia, that's something, and it's not everybody's experience, and how and where they've gotten their enjoyment from watching these series are going to be specific to all individuals. But for me, it's something that I used to watch with my mom being English from Bournemouth and very animal oriented. So we used to watch the 70s version of it. And then I ended up reading the books, and and I now watch the current one, which I think is just brilliant. And Sam West as Siegfried I'm sorry, Robert Hardy, but Sam West as Siegfried is just rocking it. And that nostalgia, it appeals, well, it sets off the serotonin and the dopamine, and that your that sense of personal nostalgia, that reminds me of being with my mom, and being able to have that sense of traveling through time, not just traveling through time from now until the 1940s, but it's from now to the late 80s, early 90s, and that sense of sort of duality between the experience, I think, is so strong, and it definitely activates your neurochemicals with it. Talking about all this makes me think about how it was done 30 years ago in terms of those series being created, those films being created. And then, of course, what's happened since with Downton Abbey, which I've loved. And I loved the TV series more than I loved the films. I don't think I'm probably the only one with that. But again, just nice to have the characters, there, and, that Sunday night sort of music that makes you feel so much better. But if you're going to make a visitor experience out of Pride and Prejudice or Sense and Sensibility or Wuthering Heights that's just come out this weekend, what's different about it today versus if you'd had to do it 30 years ago?
I think the difference now between 30 years ago is that there was a slight, I'm going to say a slight paranoia within the production industry that they didn't want to share how they create the worlds. It was very much locked down. So, you weren't allowed to, nobody was allowed to actually share in the production aspect or have an understanding of the production. We know that what we're seeing has been created because, this isn't a reel that's been found in a dusty cupboard that they've suddenly produced that was shot at that time. So it has to be a recreated scenario to be able to deliver that production. But in the 90s, it was very much everything was on lockdown. Nobody talked about how this world was created. We weren't given an insight. That was our only touch point with that production, was the production itself. And now, when you have, so for example, you had a Sense and Sensibility 30 years ago. We have another version, obviously, coming out later this year, which is a working titles film. It's, everyone's looking forward to it. I think it's this September. Um, the difference will be is that we will be able to, as a viewing audience, gain a wider insight. There will be interviews that have already been shot with the cast while on location. There will be sideline narratives around aspects of Regency life, whether it's either the cast attempting to master fan communication by how they send a discreet message across the room. And
And you're an expert in that, aren't you?
I've
You've taught
dabbled.
some classes on fan work, I
I've,
believe.
I've I've dabbled. I do tend to leave it to the experts, though, to be quite honest with you. I'm one of these people that I can jump in if needed. But it's that kind of thing where we now want more than just the production, and especially with high-end TV, with HETV, it's the production companies and the distributors, the streamers, are realizing that there is more to the world than just the world of the series, and that's what people are reaching out for, and that's what people are searching for to maintain their interest in the production, often between series. And I think that's really important because it's breaking down those boundaries, and that gives Heritage the opportunity to open a different type of negotiation with the production companies to say we'd like to tell not only the story of the show itself, the narrative. So Pride and Prejudice was shot here. We want to tell the story of how it was shot. How did you get how much dirt covered our tarmac driveway to recreate that Regency effect? How did we clear it up? How did we put it down? All of those things, because that is inherently interesting as well. And it's actually part of the heritage site story. And if they grasp it to say we're a film set, we're a heritage location, we have our own narrative, it all becomes part of that wider umbrella, and the consumer is interested.
It's really funny sort of talking about this and sort of the connections that my brain makes because you see that interest in sort of all things contextual as something that's sort of really happened over the last sort of 30 years. And there's a whole sort of philosophical um uh discussion about that called metamodernism.
Mm.
And actually, it's about, whereas postmodernism is about all about the context. It's about the individual. Metamodernism is about the individual perspective set inside that context and what does it mean. And it's something that's came out of the late 90s and is still going on today. So when did you first start noticing that screen tourism was becoming a distinct thing rather than just destination marketing? How did that move? How did and has the way that we have created film and television, particularly, heritage themed film and television, has that changed in response to screen tourism? Are they is it a living, breathing sort of ecosystem now? Or is it still just the film and content product first and the screen tourism as an after effect?
I think it depends on who makes it and the type of production. Um, so, for example, when you look at productions like Game of Thrones, I mean that was always going to be a family. Game of Thrones was mapped out for 20 years, based on the pretense of, well, let's see if the first chunk's successful, but we need to start laying the ground for future spin-off series. So when you've got something like that, I think there was, with that kind of context, there's always that thought of this is this is deeply entrenched with a fan relationship, this kind of production. So that I think when you've got examples like that, there is always going to be in the back of that wearing mind that there's an opportunity for touch point creation, with that kind of thing. So you get that kind of model, which we've seen in New Zealand with with Hobbiton, where people can visit Hobbiton and the effect that that's had on New Zealand tourism. Because you not only are inspired to travel by watching the films, you know that you have an end touch point which you can actually connect with. The same with Leavesden Studio, the same with the Game of Thrones studio experience. Whereas the difference, I think, with heritage is that in many instances, apart from, a modern lamp and the odd piece of sort of, I don't know, contemporary 19 sort of 70s bespoke designed furniture that might be sitting in the corner of a room, a lot of the historic houses actually already have the perfect setting. I mean, nobody can sit on it, obviously, because nobody sat on that particular chair for about 200 years. And everybody is in fear that if anybody did sit on it, it would collapse, hence the teasel. But you have that opportunity where you already have that backdrop. So I think with period dramas and heritage settings, and why that formula works so well here for the UK heritage industry as filming locations, because they are real. So I think in that instance, and especially when you get what I call star houses, so you get houses that are absolutely intrinsic to the narrative of that production, whether it's Highclere Castle for Downton, whether it's Castle Howard for Brideshead Revisited. So they actually take on a life of their own. We're seeing this with Babington, with the Gentleman series, that the actual house is very much intrinsically part of the narrative. So it is a shift. You've got the big studios who are obviously great planners because they're thinking way ahead. But then you've got that opportunity of the repeat business of the TV series where they are repeat visiting and repeat filming in a set location because it's intrinsic to the narrative. And that is starting to generate a lot more of a sort of more of a joined up approach around screen tourism.
It's something you just said there really sort of tickled me because you mentioned the Gentleman, and my dad was talking to me a couple weeks ago, and he said, "Sarah, you've got the coolest job. You get to do like history for work." I'm like, "I know, it is quite cool." And he goes, "But you're not an academic." And I said, "No, but we raise money and we work with amazing people like you, Seren, and we do all this cool stuff." And he goes, "You're like the Susie Glass of the heritage world." And I said, "Dad, I'll take that." Okay. So that just sparked a little memory for me. So is screen tourism like the modern version of the literary pilgrimage, or do you think it's something fundamentally new? So people going to places because they've read something is something that actually started in the 18th century with sort of grand tours, and then it was the birth of Thomas Cook and people going around Europe, going further afield. Is there something connected, or do you think that there's something fundamentally different between the two?
I think it's an extension. It's definitely extending on that experience. I mean, the interesting thing is that what you find is that with literary tourism, it's a pilgrimage to the site of the writer. And I think that's sort of so, it is, and last year I actually took my daughter to Haworth to go to the parsonage. And she was aware of Brontë. I probably would have to lead her kicking and screaming to actually read it, but she was aware of it. But the harsh realization when we exited the parsonage, she was quiet for nearly half an hour. And I actually thought, really didn't like that at all. That was a bit of a move from mum. And then she started talking about it and she said, "I just didn't realize how hard it was. My God, how hard it was." She said, "I can't believe that she couldn't even publish under her own name, that how famous she was and how famous her books are. And she had to live like that. And the tragedy that surrounded her life, and it almost left her sort of soul searching as an experience." And I think So literary pilgrimage is very much that I want to walk where Wordsworth walked when he was inspired. It puts you in the shoe leather of the writer, whereas screen tourism opens up the world. It's and it's also about opening up the world to other people's interpretation of it, because when these famous authors, they wrote for the page, they didn't write for the screen, because the screen didn't exist when they wrote it down. So they wrote for the page and the imagination of your mind, for the interpretation of how those characters and how those scenes would play out. And then now we have this sort of like a filter of that, which is the interpretation for screen. And sometimes, as an audience, we do not like the interpretations because we are saying that they are not true to the book. But they are interpretations, just how somebody would be inspired by a piece of artwork to then create something that looks nothing like that artwork. But they are inspired by it, that freedom, that sense of challenge, that pushing to the limits. So, and I think that's the interesting thing is that it widens up the scope of who can engage with that piece of art, that piece of literature, because it's about, I might not read the book, but I have connected. And if they don't get it 100% right, is that a wrong thing? I think sometimes we get a little bit too hung up if it's not actually right. Even an interpretation of history. Oh my God, they got those facts wrong. That character never met that character. They didn't actually go there. They didn't wear those kind of things. Are we missing the point in the fact that what it's doing is sparking an interest? And I think that is what screen tourism actually does do. It sparks interest for people to go back and potentially dig out truths. They might believe what they're seeing is right, but it will force them to dig out truths. I mean, the spiraling searches of the ethnicity of Queen Charlotte on the back of Bridgerton have gone on, which actually has created an area where we can discuss ethnicity in Georgian England. We weren't talking about that before. So it's that kind of thing. We shouldn't rule it out.
I totally agree. It's so I was just picking up on something you said about sometimes we don't like the interpretation of that book or the reinterpretation of that iconic film or TV series. So I went to Florence for the first time in 2007 because of A Room with a View. And Room with a View is obviously Forster, but it's because of the Merchant Ivory films in the 80s that I went there, and I can quote vast tracts of the Room with a View script whilst there, and we went to all the places and I was there with my mum, dad, and my husband, and all the places that they went to,
Mm.
and we so enjoyed it that obviously the history of the Duomo, the Medici's, all of that, the massive queue outside the Disney store that we were trying to avoid at the time, that was all part of the enjoyment of being in Florence, was because we were seeing it through the eyes of Room with a View. I refuse to see any adaptations of A Room with a View since then because I cannot bear it. It emotionally hurts as a part of that. But then there are other adaptations of other things where I think it's absolutely perfect. And yes, why spoil a good story for want of a few facts? Because at the end of the day, we didn't capture all the facts anyway. So I've worked on many projects, throughout my career in heritage that, challenges the whole concept of a whitewashed Britain. We are a migration story, and in fact, we were incredibly well connected globally, for thousands of years, and we had lots of different people in Britain of different ethnicity, but we just didn't capture their stories because of endemic racism and prejudice and privilege that still exists. So there is an element of this where I sort of look at saying when we do versions of period drama or literary adaptations, do you think that there will be some people who say just what you've said, we're polishing away what is real or not real in that period Britain? or we're making things up, we're being, too postmodern about it. But I think actually, I think you're right. I think it's making us ask questions that we weren't asking before. But do you think there's a risk with any of this, and how do we deal with that risk?
I think there's always going to be an element of the more risks you take, the more risks might occur as a knock-on effect, or the way you might split your critics.
Mm.
And I think we've seen this with the latest adaptation of Wuthering Heights. There's definitely been a critic split on that one. But I think it's more about it's being inspired by. And we're forgetting that actually today we can use these sources to be inspired by, and it creates new versions, new adaptations, new interpretations. And I think that's actually quite important. It's about pushing. If you take at the very heart of what the Brontes wanted to do with their work, and you look at something like Wuthering Heights, when it was first published, it was absolutely slated by the critics as being immoral. You know, um, the disdain for it was absolutely phenomenal. Because of that pushing of boundaries back then, 180 years ago. So, should we criticize the fact that being inspired by the drive behind that piece of literature, that another interpretation wouldn't want to challenge us through using that as an inspiration?
And
I don't think it needs to be.
what's art if it isn't challenging,
Exactly.
at the end of the day?
Exactly. There is always a version of Wuthering Heights that people can go back to and watch that is a little bit closer to the book. So it's not like we don't have other options, and it's not like we're wiping the slate clean every time we do an interpretation of something like one of these novels. So there will always be, you choose. You have the freedom to choose which one you prefer, and that's a good thing.
It is. It's options, it's reinterpretations, it's whatever, resonates with you. Why do you think Gothic romance still, you know, does something for people? We there's data in out there saying that actually, we're having fewer children. There are, our societies are less sort of in touch with our kind of romantic sides, but yet it's still fodder for film, for TV, for books, for things like that. What is it that works? Why is it that people still gravitate towards it as a source for?
I think we secretly none of us want to conform. I think that's probably a driving factor for it. And it doesn't matter which generation you're talking to. If I was to ask my mother, who's in her 80s, who read the book and actually thoroughly enjoyed probably the 1970s version of Wuthering Heights, it's about the fact that it has a touch point because we don't want to conform. Her generation didn't want to conform. I went through periods where I didn't want to conform. I'm sure I'm going to see it with my daughter, where she doesn't want to conform. And I think where you can find touch points of pushing back against conformity, it's always going to be topical. It's always going to be current because it challenges. And I think that's why we like to see challenge unfold on the screen. And we like to see people on screen pushing boundaries because even if we feel we're not in a position to do it, we feel that we constantly have a heroine that never ever ceases to be present, that is always doing that, whether that's the writer or the narrative of the stories of which they've created unfold on the screen. So if you look at something like the latest version of Frankenstein, it, it's beautiful in the way it's constructed. It's it creates these worlds that you can immerse yourself in. It's not real, and it's not real, but it's a sense of escapism and challenge and pushing and questioning. it stops you, it makes you think, and that never ages. I think that's something that every generation wants to embrace and engage with.
And I think it's a female thing as well. I think it's, it's non-conformity against the patriarchy. It's how it's non-conformity in certain ways of, how do we connect with a deeper sense of ourselves as well.
Mm.
I've only got time for one more question, Saren, but this has been so much fun. Tell me what you think we're gonna see next in terms of screen tourism. What do you think is coming down the line, and how do you think sort of heritage and cultural organizations, and creatives and curators and directors and writers, all of those people who play that role in sort of keeping our culture at the fore. What do you think we're going to start seeing next from them?
Well, next on the slate, as they call it, is we're just about to enter into another round of, well, we're entering into another round of frocks and bonnets, that is for sure, because we have a Pride and Prejudice. Basically, it's a 10-year itch with Pride and Prejudice. So 1995, 2005, 2016. Oh, we're due for another, and funnily enough, that's what we're getting. So we're getting another round of that. And interestingly enough, other that has, I think, aligned to the celebrations last year around the life of Jane Austen. I think it was 250 years, I think, the
Yeah.
celebration.
Yeah.
So it's you've got that strain, but we also have a complete and utter immersion into the world of fantasy with a reinterpretation of Harry Potter, whether people want it or don't want it. It's coming, but I think what is going to be more interesting is this journey we're going to be taking with the Chronicles of Narnia, and I think that's actually going to have quite a big impact for a viewing audience, because although we had the Disney films, they didn't actually fulfill the full journey of the questioning that the Narnia books actually went down that path to do. And I think that will be quite interesting. So fantasy, I think, is going to be uh, a major element of escape, but because of the heavy use of locations, we will have those touch points. And I think what it will do is it will bring landscape more to the fore, because we have been very focused on built heritage around productions, to date, whereas we are pushing back, and it's the dramatic aspects of our landscapes and how they inspire. And I think the forerunner of that was the success of films like Dune, with making us actually, although we loved the cinematic experience of watching the films, it was that realization of a beauty of something that we might necessarily have put to one side, the beauty of the desert, for example, and how we are seeing the wider picture. So I think that is going to be, for me, that is going to be that move of people actually using screen tourism to engage with landscape. And that hasn't really kicked in yet, because okay, it's very difficult to say, and this is a major Roman battle scene, and you're looking at a dip in the woods sort of thing. So the use of technology and how we actually recreate that and interpret that for the visiting audience, I think is going to be quite interesting.
And it's the subject of what you and I and have been talking about for the last little while. So definitely watch this space. I'll just say one thing, the little bit meta connections on everything we've been talking about today. I mentioned Sinners earlier today. Um, Wuthering Heights with Ray Fiennes. Jack O'Connell was in that version of Wuthering Heights. Ray Fiennes and Jack O'Connell are in 28 years later, Bone Temple, which I saw last night, which was excellent. And then obviously Jack O'Connell is in Sinners, and there's been all sorts of conversations, and I bet you even know who the next James Bond's going to be. But I have a theory. It's going to be Jack O'Connell. So I probably completely wrong, but he's the right age group, and he's been in everything lately. So Jack, if you're listening, we're a big fan. Anyway, Saren, thank you so much. I don't know if you have a comment on that one at all, if any hints on the grapevine about who the next Bond's going to be, but who knows?
Who knows? Who knows? It's when it does come out, it's going to be with us for quite a while.
Yeah, exactly. So hence they're looking for somebody of a certain age. Anyway, thank you so much for joining today, Saren. There's nothing
My
more
pleasure.
I enjoy than talking about film and TV and how that connects to heritage and all the exciting things that we get to work on together and with our own respective clients. So I really appreciate your time.
Absolutely loved it. Thank you for inviting me.
And before we go, thank you to our sponsor, the Tricola Collective. Tricola is a heritage development consultancy helping cultural projects unlock funding, build sustainable futures, and turn bold ideas into lasting impact. If you need expert support for a heritage or cultural project, they're the people to speak to. Find out more in the show notes.